is Nidam, and I'm an assistant professor of teaching at the University of British Columbia in the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies. And I teach popular media, board games in particular. I'm seeing like a lot of really shocked faces, which I absolutely love. By training, I'm actually a comics scholar, so that's even, I guess that's equally wild. Well, anyway, it's my pleasure today to introduce our speakers. The University of British Columbia's Popular Culture Cluster, which is one of the units on campus that tries to foster discourse on popular media, came together to put together this particular roundtable, which features two Indigenous artists working in board game design, an Indigenous consultant on game design. So it is my pleasure to not be here to be part of this conversation, but to have facilitated this conversation, which is why I'm not even in the camera right now. So we have David Plamondon, who will speak first about his work with Wiikwe-amik-oong games. And we have Darin Corbiere, who will talk about his work on the game, The Truth and Reconciliation. And then we have Luke Parnell, who is also working on several games at the moment, who will be sharing his work and how this work connects with the goals and priorities of these individual artists, but also intervening in global board game and tabletop gaming discourses that kind of capitalize on narratives of settler colonialism. So I'll be around later if you want to talk about, I don't know, academic-y things. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand it over to our wonderful speakers. Thank you so much for joining us in Vancouver. We're thrilled to have you. Please take it away from here.
Thanks so much, Biz. So my name is David Plamondon. I am Cree from Treaty 8 territory. I'm officially registered with Whitefish 459 in northern Alberta, but my family has deep roots to the Capowino area, and I'm now living in Aa-nishin-aabe, which is the Cree name for Edmonton. I'm also the team guide for Wiikwe Together, which is a blended company that incorporates both Wiikwe games and Wiikwe consulting, and will hopefully sometime this year move into also embodying Wiikwe Press. So I'll give you a very quick overview of the work that we do, just so you kind of understand the context of our approach and where we fit into the board game industry. So in 2019, we had originally started Wiikwe Consulting with a very clear vision of wanting to utilize tabletop games as a way of engaging Indigenous youth and helping develop foundational life skills. So that would include leadership, that would include collaboration, communication, numeracy, literacy, all of these foundational skills that we've seen as major gaps for a lot of Indigenous youth, particularly when they transition into urban settings or urban communities away from their home. And it's not rooted in those Indigenous youth not having the same skill set or the same capacity for learning. It's that they don't have the same exposure to a lot of the things that folks, particularly in urban settings, take for granted. So my background prior to starting Wiikwe Consulting was doing recruitment and employment and education counseling. So I had a lot of opportunities to work with Indigenous youth and saw a lot of potential, but again, a lot of those transitionary gaps. So our vision for Wiikwe Consulting at first was to just identify games that would help build those foundational life skills, develop supports and aids for educators, for community engagement folks, and help them bring those games to the community, help those youth develop those skills by playing those games, and help activate that learning, that enthusiasm for learning in a model that's more authentic to Indigenous folks as experiential learners. Because we started in 2019, some of you might have remembered a big event that happened in 2020, which really put a big impact into our ability to engage with communities, with schools, libraries, etc. So we had to pivot the business. We still keep a focus for engaging with youth and community, but now we expand into a lot more grassroots level work, advocacy work, cultural competency training, and culture change management with a specific focus on EDI and decolonization focused things. We also have an opportunity to work a lot with our nations in Alberta. We work with the Confederacy of Treaty 6 in providing them technical services, running mics and blended meetings for them, and we do a lot of other community engagement focused work. In 2021, we had the great fortune to open Wiikwe Games, which is a community-focused retail and tabletop space in Edmonton. For those of you who are familiar with Edmonton, we're right in the heart of Alberta Avenue, which is one of Edmonton's oldest neighborhoods, and it's also one of Edmonton's highest barrier neighborhoods. It's long had a reputation for having vulnerable populations, unhoused folks who are experiencing substance addiction. And so for us, we wanted to be in a space where there were a lot of already negative stereotypes about Indigenous representation in the community and push back against those stereotypes and show not only non-Indigenous folks in the neighborhood, but also Indigenous folks in the neighborhood, the strength, the resilience, and the community benefits that Indigenous people bring to neighborhoods. So we've had 4 great years in that space, and we're looking for many, many more. With Pimento Games, we have a very core mandate of prioritizing community over everything else. So how we do that is we offer discounts to community organizations and to educators who are looking to bring games in to reduce that financial barrier. We prioritize access to our play space. So we do have a suggested $5 cost to utilize the play space, but we'll happily waive that to anybody who doesn't have the capacity or ability to pay for that. We host frequent themed events. Every Thursday is our queer night, where we have a safe and inclusive space for the LGBTQ2S plus community. We host family game nights, and we host a bunch of other events, and with the hope of increasing access to the hobby, where many folks have previously not been actively included or involved in the tabletop hobby. And then our future plans are to launch Pimento Press to help create better inroads. James will talk a little bit about his experience in navigating and publishing. I'm sure Luke will as well. But the reality is there are a ton of barriers for everybody who wants to move into moving from a game idea into a game into the market. And then when you layer on having a game that's Indigenous themed or Indigenous designed, or that reflects more challenging concepts or concepts that aren't as familiar or palatable to the broader market, you add an extra layer of challenges on top of that. So part of our focus with Pimento Press is to use the platform that we have with the consulting work in the game space, but also help reduce barriers for other Indigenous creators or Indigenous themed games that have been done in a consultative manner to help move into the hobby. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on this just because I don't want to eat up too much of the time from Luke or James, because they have a lot of important things to say. But I want to talk a little bit about settler colonialism, because that is the reason why folks like Luke and folks like James are so important to Indigenous representation. Because as Indigenous people, we have been constantly under attack and under threat by settler colonialism since the beginning of Canada's birth on Turtle Island, from the first day European folks came here. And this isn't meant to be a criticism or attack on anybody who's non-Indigenous, but it is important that we confront the past and we recognize how it impacts us in modern times. So I'm not going to go into too many details on all the specifics, but these are some of the key events that have happened over Indigenous people's history, and this is what we have lived with, from the Doctrine of Discovery to the Indian Act to the residential schools, the 60 Scoop, and all of this parlays into modern challenges, into intergenerational trauma, and to testing the resiliency of Indigenous people. Our reality and our existence has constantly been under threat by Canada as wanting to absorb us into the body politic and to enfranchise us into Canada's melting pot or salad bowl, depending on which term you want to use. And that's normally fine in terms of wanting to build a strong nation, but the way Canada has done it is through coercion and through force, rather than allowing us to find our own place within this tapestry of a country. And of course, one of the most insidious methods of a settler colonial state is to use various levels of oppression. So anyone who's taken an intro to sociology, you're probably familiar with this. The transposing of oppression through the different stages. So typically, oppressive systems will start with ideological oppression, which outlines what the dominant state is, what the in-group is, or what the ideal scenario is for good citizens or good members of an ideological oppressed state, which historically has, of course, excluded Indigenous people. Once you have that ideology, you start to move towards institutionalized oppressive systems, which, again, we saw outlined here with the residential schools, the Indian Act, and all of these other oppressive systems that are hard-coded into Canada's legislative body. Once you have the ideology and the institutionalized oppression in place, then you start to move into the interpersonal oppression. And that's when you start to see things like negative stereotypes manifest. That's when you start to see conscious and unconscious biases. That's when you start to see the general public absorb what is now institutionalized and ideological and start to say, yes, that's acceptable. It's acceptable to oppress Indigenous people because they are lesser than non-Indigenous people, because they have fallen victim to various things, because they're not as good as the ideology of our oppressive system. And then you move into internalized oppression, which is then Indigenous people starting to internalize that idea that Indigenous people are in fact lesser than the non-Indigenous counterparts that they have. And then they start to question their place in that oppressive system. And that's where we get into media-based oppression, and that's what I think is so important with the work that James and Luke are doing, is that they are pushing back against this ideology and this institutionalized oppressive idea that Indigenous people have no value in Canadian society, or that Indigenous people no longer have a place. Because when we consume media, and when we look at board games, when we look at video games, when we look at how we're represented, it typically falls into one of two broad categories. We're either modern stereotypes that lean into very harmful tropes, such as drug addiction, being unhoused, being being alcoholics, being all of these negative stereotypes, or we move into this historicized piece of representation where we were once here, we were once horse riding, bow wielding, drum beating savages, and now we're no longer here. Canada has solved its Indian problem and removed us from the tapestry. So when you are a young Indigenous person like I was, who fell in love with Dungeons and Dragons, who fell in love with board games, and I was consuming that media, I never saw myself represented, or when I did, it was always through harmful tropes. So what that does is start to layer into your psyche that you don't actually belong in this world. You don't belong at the tables, and you certainly don't belong in the design space. And so part of the work that we do, Pametwe Consulting, James and Luke are doing, is pushing back against that idea that we don't belong at these tables, because for too long they have been dominated by the ideological dominant groups, and they haven't left space for Indigenous designers, Black designers, LGBTQS plus designers. And so we need to address that and move forward into better representation and better space. So when we look at modern representation for Indigenous people, we need to recognize that Indigenous people aren't solely identified by their indigeneity, and Indigenous modern representation has a lot of different flavors and a lot of different layers. Some Indigenous folks who had the privilege of being raised in their communities, speaking their traditional languages, engaging in their cultural practices. A lot of Indigenous people, again, because of those ideology and the institutionalized oppression, never had those opportunities. So when you look for modern representation, or when you engage modern representation, you need to engage with Indigenous people where they're at in their representation and their engagement with their Indigenous culture. When you're engaging with historical representation of Indigenous people, you need to recognize that Indigenous people had distinct sovereignty prior to European colonization. When somebody tells you that they are Japanese or Chinese or Laotian, you wouldn't then refer to them as an Asian. You would refer to them as their country of origin. When somebody tells you they're German or Polish or Ukrainian, you would again refer to them as that country of origin. But when I tell you I'm Cree, or James tells you he's Aa-nishin-aabe, you would still refer to us as Indigenous people. You don't reflect or respect our sovereignty in the nations, the language, and the culture that we come from. And so that pan-Indigenous approach, again, tends to historicize and erase our distinct sovereignty as unique nations that predate any sort of European colonization. And it also erases that historical treaty obligation that Canada has with many, many nations. I know here in BC we're on unceded territory, but we still tend to ignore those traditional territories, those traditional tribes, those traditional cultural practices that Indigenous people still maintain to this day. Biz had mentioned that Pametwe Consulting has had the opportunity to provide some cultural consulting work for some games. Off the Page Games, James Cormier is doing a demo right now of his new game. He also has a prototype of Core of Discovery, which we were very lucky to be able to provide some feedback on. Core of Discovery is based off of a comic book called Manifest Destiny, which highlighted an alternative history of Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea exploring and exploiting Turtle Island. So it's a very sensitive topic, and we had a lot of in-depth conversations about whether or not those sorts of games should exist. We're all familiar with games that highlight and support and promote colonization. We're familiar with games that exploit slavery and other complex topics. I don't speak for every Indigenous person or every person from a marginalized community, but I do think it is important to highlight and discuss these games, to explore them as educational tools, and to not, again, erase both the positive and negative sides of history. But it's really important to do these in a sensitive and a culturally respectful way while also reflecting the true history. One example of a game we were asked to consult on, I don't know if the game's ever been released, but it was a project management game in which the goal here was that every card represented a person who you could hire for your team, and every person had a set of skills and then a thing that they were passionate about. So if you look at the two characters on the right, the rightmost character with the hard hat, he's very into his cell phone or his tablet. The second person coming from the right has a unique pet. And then the last two people, again, in a modern setting, are entirely dominated and represented by their indigeneity. So this was the original design that the designer brought to me. So you have two people who would not stand out in a crowd like this, and then two people who look like they just walked out of a portrait from 1682. So it was really problematic. And I said, why are your Indigenous characters represented like this? Like, how many Indigenous people have you met? And the reality is that that designer probably has never met an Indigenous person. But we exist. We are here. We're not always easy to find, but we don't look like that unless we are specifically going to a cultural ceremony or dressing up for a play. Fortunately, I was able to help direct that person into a more modern depiction of two Indigenous women. The first one, a hockey player, who, again, other than the high cheekbones and the skin tone, you wouldn't necessarily clock her as an Indigenous person because, again, she is not solely identified or solely reflected by her indigeneity. She's reflected that she is a hockey player. She's athletic and sporty. The second woman, a little bit older, a little bit more connected to her culture. She makes ribbon skirts in her spare time, and she reflects her commitment to her community by wearing an orange shirt. These are subtle things that can still reflect modern indigeneity without falling on these harmful tropes that paint us with a single broad brush. Another example, Netatonka, a game from a design perspective that I really love, but from every other perspective I hate. The designer has gone on record repeatedly defending the game by saying, we didn't base this game off any real group of people. It's just a fictional game about a fictional group of people. And yes, that group of people might live in teepees, and they might have totem poles, and they might subsist entirely off of bison, and they might have bow and arrows, and they might have drums, and they might wear feathers, but that doesn't mean anything. That's just a fictional group of people that we just manufactured for the sake of this game. And that is an all too common response when we talk about indigeneity and we talk about sovereignty, is that you are not a real people. You are unicorns and dragons and centaurs. You were a people that existed 300 years ago, and now you're gone. So why are you complaining? You don't have a position to complain because you don't exist. And again, it comes down to media oppression and how we are constantly misrepresented and how we are relegated to being these fantasy creatures that never existed. And when you tell a child that enough times, they start to believe it. Alternatively, there are some games that have done some great consultation, non-Indigenous design, but done with the consultation and research that is meaningful and reflectful of actual Indigenous sovereignty. Wendoc, I don't know who the original publisher was. I believe it's published by Renegade Games now. Did a ton of research into the tribes in the Wendoc Huron area. The game itself is about Indigenous sovereignty, and it's about Indigenous resource gathering. There is conflict, but the conflict is really about territories and tribal warfare. The French and English War is a backdrop to the game, which is an inverse to most Indigenous games or most Indigenous representations, where we are either an obstacle to be overcome or we are a backdrop to broader colonial thoughts. And then, of course, Inuit, the Snowfolk, the designers of the game, the entire front page of the rulebook is a whole letter to the player saying that we are not Inuit people, but we designed this game with the consultation and engagement with Inuit people. And if you are interested in learning more about Inuit culture, then those are the individuals you need to connect with. You need to go to the Arctic and you need to meet with Inuit people and learn the culture from them. So it was a love letter to understanding what meaningful cultural engagement and meaningful, respectful sovereignty looks like. I'm going to close up very quickly and let James and Luke talk about their games, but I wanted to highlight a few other Indigenous designed games because this is the gold standard. The work that James is doing, the work that Luke is doing, this is the type of work that we need to see more of. Indigenous people designing games about Indigenous culture. Burn the Fort was designed by Clee Benelli. Clee is unfortunately no longer with us. He passed away last year, but Clee was an artist, a musician, an activist, and a game designer. And Clee designed Burn the Fort as a way of highlighting what Indigenous resistance looks like and what Indigenous history actually was. It is a game in which you play Indigenous war leaders, actual war leaders from history, and you are repelling colonizers who have come to your land and are trying to take your land by force, because that is the reality. Not this beautiful picture of Thanksgiving where we all cut up turkeys and gave out corn, and not this idea that we lost a massive war. It is an attack on our sovereignty and our land, and in Burn the Fort, it actually reflects that true history. Wolves was designed by Connor Alexander, and it's part of his Coyote and Crow line. So Wolves is set in the world of Coyote and Crow, in which you are all playing tribal leaders who are providing resources for your community. It's a semi-cooperative game in which each individual player is required to provide 3 corn, 3 bison, and 3 fish. And if any player is not able to meet those obligations, the other players can gift those resources to them. And if they don't, and one tribe starves, everybody loses. So it reflects that communal, gift-giving, community-focused engagement that where we might compete for things, but we don't ultimately want to see harm come to one another. Nunami was designed by Thomas E. Manchek, who's an Inuk designer out of northern Quebec. Thomas E. made the game as a love letter to his culture and to the life on the Arctic and that balance between humankind and nature. He had the opportunity to have his daughter, his mother, and I believe his wife design the art. So it's entirely designed by Inuk designers and artists. It's reflective of that balance, and it's a beautiful game that was actually designed specifically to be played outside in nature. The entire game is plastic, so you can play it outside without any wear and tear. And the final game isn't released yet, but it will be released this year. Winter Rabbit by Will Thompson, a Cherokee designer out of the U.S. Will wanted to make a game that was reflective of his Cherokee roots, and so Winter Rabbit is based on Cherokee lore and mythology, and it's a beautiful game that's going to be printed in both English and in the traditional Cherokee language. So not only is it a game, but it's also a language revitalization project. I've gone over a little over time, so I'm going to close this off by saying we have Indigenous youth today, teenagers, preteens, elementary age, that do not see themselves reflected in the media, that may not have seen Reservation Dogs, that may not have seen Echo, that don't have an opportunity to see Luke's game or James's games or any of the other designs I've talked about. So until we recognize and reconcile Canada's history as a settler colonial state and start to create more active inclusion and inviting more Indigenous youth to events like this, to our tables, and more importantly, reflecting them in the games that we're making, we're never going to move past this intergenerational trauma, and Canada is never going to fulfill and live up to its obligations that they made to us in a variety of promises in both treaty and in the Indian Act. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to James, who's going to have a much friendlier and much happier discussion.
Hello. My name is James Darin Corbiere. I am Aa-nishin-aabe, originally from Manitoulin Island in Lake Huron. I was a police officer for a number of years in the city of Sudbury, then in my hometown. An injury at work changed my career course. I became at first I was a grade 5 teacher, an elementary school teacher, my first teaching job, and I hated it. The next job I had was at secondary school, which is a little better. And one of the things I did is teach my language. I taught Aa-nishin-aabe. So when there weren't enough students to run an Aa-nishin-aabe class, they would give me Canadian history to teach. And so I taught also grade 10 Canadian history. And the first, probably the second time around teaching it, I thought, no, these aren't accurate. These facts, these Canadian contemporary history facts don't align with my experience of Canadian history, right, or Indigenous experience. And so in May 2017, the long weekend, the May 2-4 weekend, I thought, I'm going to get my students ready for the exam. The exams are coming up in June, and so I had these cheat sheets, and I went out and I thought, well, the cheat sheets are going to be pretty boring. I mean, the students probably aren't going to read them, right? They're not going to use them to study. So I thought, well, maybe cutting them up and putting them into flashcards would do the trick. And so I created all these little flashcards, and I thought, well, even then, that's going to get kind of boring. And so I thought, well, what is it? How can we make this a little more challenging? And I thought, well, let's talk about what happened to Indigenous people, right? And I threw in some currency. So there's no money in the game, but in the game, I had land, language, culture, and identity. And so these were the currency or the values in the game. And at the beginning of the game, you were an Indigenous player, or you were both. You were an Indigenous player, or you were the church or the crown. Now, being a put emphasize on the REZ in resourceful. So got hair clips here to hold the player cards on. So I incorporated some, I guess some of the sacred teachings or some Indigenous knowledge, Anishinaabe knowledge, and I went and found some of these foam cores and created the original the game board, and it's in the shape of Turtle Island. There are, if you go from the center where it's labeled Derez in the center, and you work your way out, it's 4 sections with seven spaces each. So it's 28 spaces around to go around the circle. So that was the original game board. And these are the original, just these little cardboard players. And we had all of our currency here, the land, language, culture, and identity. And these cards, the original design was just like a deck of cards, right? 4 suits of 13 cards each. And the 4 suits it was just color coded: red, green, blue, and yellow. So it wasn't until later on when Nelson, the education publisher, was interested in the game, that I actually gave the cards names, categories. So we had the blue cards were congrats. We had treaty cards, bingo cards, and then the quintessential Canadian apology, sorry, A. So those were the first cards that were in the game. And the idea was that as you went around the board, you would draw the corresponding color-coded card, you would read the fact, and you would lose something. You would lose land, you'd lose language, you'd lose identity or culture to the Crown and the Church. And in the initial game, the Crown and the Church were active players, like you played against them, and they would take all your stuff. So that was the early game. I started working with and I also had written. I'm a graphic novel, comic book illustrator, writer. And so what had happened was I took the 52 facts in this game, in the original game, and I combined them with some artwork and basically put together the first version of the Genuine Indian Guidebook. That's what it was called, the Genuine Indian Guidebook. So this book contained the rules and then just more in-depth information that was contained in the cards. So I created this game in May 2017. I had it set up at an education conference in October 2017. Nelson Education saw the game, loved the game. I thought, okay, well, I'm going to add some artwork. So I added my artwork. And you'll have to come over and see the other artwork, but this is what it looks like now. But when Nelson went to test their markets in Ontario, in the game, we have status cards. So in the original game, you have status cards and shame cards. So the crown would issue status cards, and the Crown and the Church, they would earn shame cards. So Nelson tested their audience, and one particular school board in Ontario said that we love the game, we love the idea, but you got to take out the shame cards. And I asked, well, why? What? Like, who? First of all, who's doing this, and why are they doing it? So when they identified the Catholic school board in Ontario as the ones who rejected the idea of the shame cards, they and I asked why, and they said because they didn't want their students questioning why the Church earns shame cards. Okay. So I said, well, let me think about that. And I said no to removing the shame cards, and I produced humility cards, which is a little bit of an easier teaching, I guess, a traditional teaching, and went back to Nelson. They took it to the school boards, and the school board still said, no, we won't use it if the shame cards are in the game. And so it sat there. The game just sat there, and I've been going for the past since June 2018. I've been going out to different events, trying to do fundraising, trying to find angel investors. I went and did a stint with. I made a pitch to Dragon's Den, to try and get the funding to get this game published and out. It wasn't until June 2023 when I was referred to Medicine Wheel Publishing. I was living in Cowichan Bay on Vancouver Island, and it wasn't far. So I sent an email to the publisher, and he called me up. And a couple of days later, we had a meeting. And then within a week, the contract was signed, and they were going to go ahead. They were going to take the game, and they were going to publish everything, including the shame cards. So a year later, in August 2024. the Truth and Reconciliation game. This was released in August 2024. So in terms of the amount of work that I put into it, I would say if you were condense everything, probably about 2 years of steady work. And it was like 5 years in between of waiting, right? Just hustling, working, trying different events to try and get to a publisher. And now Medicine Wheel Publishing has picked it up and they published the game. And we only ordered 3,000 copies because we weren't sure how things were going to go. But within 6 months, we had already sold 2,000 copies. And so things are going very well. The elementary version is, we just did some work on the elementary version about 2 weeks ago. Yeah, it's Friday, right? Yeah, 2 weeks ago Friday. And the elementary version is available. You can order it online, but it won't be coming out till August in 2025. So from a study aid to help my students study to an educational resource in the form of a board game that seems to be gaining popularity, overcoming certain obstacles, especially like that. That's the biggest obstacle, right? The church, the Catholic Church, the Catholic School Board. Come on, guys! Like, come on! It's the thousands now, like the 2000s. Get with the times here. Anyway, that was probably the biggest challenge. If it hadn't been for the the fact that they didn't like the shame cards back in 2018, this game may have been published 2 or 3 years sooner, right? So all of the artwork is my own. All of the humor that goes into the original cards, all of the thinking that goes into the design of the game, everything is 100% authentic. It's 100% original. It's 100% indigenous. The current version is probably 95% indigenous or 95% true to my original vision or dream of what this game was or could be. And I'm just really very happy to be able to sit here today and talk to you. This is nothing. This is not something I had ever imagined. If you asked me 10 years ago, hey Darin, where are you going to be 10 years from now? This is not something that was even on the radar, right? So so anyway, life is good. Miigwech.
Oh, I see. I'm in charge of the tech now. I see. Do you want me to pass this to you, Luke, or you want me to run it for you?
Oh, sure, pass it. Grab a. Hi there. My name's Luke Parnell. I'm just going to introduce myself. My name's Luke Parnell. My father is Haida from Massa. My mother is Nishka from Kinkolks. My house is Laxgeek from Wokogans, and my Nishka name is Guchkachgans, which means always carving. And the reason it's a Nishka name is because both Haidas and Nishkas are matrilineal, so all my rights and privileges pass through my mother. And what I'm going to talk about today mostly is just my process. And I'm going to start with my art. Like I said, I've been a professional artist for over 20 years. This is one of my pieces. I'll talk a bit about some specific pieces, but mostly I'm just going to be showing pictures. So I got a bachelor's degree from the Ontario College of Art and Design University. And I got a master's degree from the Emily Carr University of Art and Design, I believe it's called, or Masters of Applied Arts. And I apprenticed with a master carver, Henry Green. He's a master Shunxian carver. And when I went to Henry, it was before I got my master's degree. It was after I had my bachelor's degree, I went to apprentice with Henry. And when I was learning to carve with Henry, what he would do is he would carve half a mask or half a bowl, and he'd give it to us for us to finish. I apprenticed. My cousin Ian was apprenticing as well. And for a long time, for about a year, maybe a little bit more, that's what I was doing. All I was doing was copying what he was doing. And then after that, he'd say, well, go to the museum or go get a book and pick something that you like, and I'll help you do that. And so I grabbed a picture of a mask that I really liked, and he carved a bit of the mask, and I carved a bit. then he carved a bit, then I carved a bit, until finally it started looking like it was finished. And we did that all the way through. And slowly, I'd sort of get more independence. Like I sort of caught the carving bug, and slowly he would just be helping me less and less, to the point where after all, he'd just look at a thing and just carve a little bit there, carve a little bit there, and then I'd sort of finish it up and that sort of thing. Till eventually I got to the point where Henry was saying, okay, your carving looks pretty good, but now you have to figure out figure out what important Indigenous art is. Like, learn how to dance, join a dance group, drum, figure out what this art was actually originally intended for. And so that's what I did. I joined the Wiikwe-amik-oong dancers in Prince Rupert, and I did that for about 2 years. And really started, drumming and dance. And I actually also danced with Mike D'Angeli and his group here in Vancouver. And I wore, I did dances with masks, dances with robes, had full regalia, made my regalia, drummed, sing songs about masks, songs telling stories where we use masks. And I really got an understanding of what the art was originally intended for. And I got to a point where it's like I had this training. Like when I went to OCAD, I studied conceptual art. So I did a lot of stuff with like I had one show where I had like 10 cans of like jarred salmon. I just numbered them 1 to 10, and that was my art piece for an exhibition. And that's sort of the conceptual art that I did. Like I did, like when I graduated from OCAD, I couldn't even draw because I was doing all conceptual art, and I loved it. I loved every single moment of it. And then when I left there, a few years later, I apprenticed with Henry, where I was making objects. Where honestly, my goal for the first years was just to make beautiful objects. And if I'd stayed down that path, I would still be doing that. I'd probably be a master carver. But I got to a point where I was like, I want to mix my conceptual art training with my traditional training. And that's what I said. Well, I need to get a master's degree because I need time. Because if you're carving as I've been carving for a living for 20 years, and there's just no time. Like you have to work all the time, and I need time to sort of explore ideas without having to worry about making money. So I went to school and I did that for 2 years, and I sort of studied what I was doing. Like for example, this piece is called The Dreamer, and this piece is called Burning Rain. So I'm going to use this as an example. So this was originally part of a film I made called Remediation. It's on YouTube. It's called look up Luke Parnell Remediation, and that film was a reaction to a film by Bill Reed made in the 1950s called The Thomas Tolan's Skangway. And that was happening in the 1950s when him and a group of anthropologists went to Haida, and they cut down a bunch of old totem poles, and they brought them down south to be put in museums or sold to private collectors. And the tone of the film was really condescending, and it really made me angry. And there's even one line in it where Bill Reed goes, the white men are growing their beards, and all the natives are using their electric razors. And they're really separating the Haidas that carved those totem poles from the Haidas who brought them out there on their boats, and the Haidas who were helping them cut down the totem poles. So they made sure that there was that huge difference. And I thought, I have to react to this because it really makes me angry. I'm not a filmmaker. And I thought, well, so I tried to find a way to react to it without making a film. I thought, well, I'll do a carving, or I'll do a drawing, or I'll do a painting. And then finally, but nothing was working. So I thought, well, it has to be a film. So luckily I have friends who are filmmakers, and we made this film where I basically was carving a totem pole in Montreal for a festival there. And then I cut it in half, and I carried the top half all the way back to BC, and I hiked around Victoria, hiked around Vancouver Island until finally we went to a beach and we burnt the top half of the totem pole. And so if you watch the film, that's how it ends, with the top half burning. But unfortunately, it was pouring rain, and we were burning it for 4 flipping hours, and it wouldn't burn. And so I had this. And my friend who was the filmmaker is like, Luke, don't ever show anybody this. And so finally, after about 5 years, or after a few years after the film was finally made and I was out, and I was like, well, I had this in a box for quite a few years. And I remember I showed a curator, and he looks up at me and goes, how much do you want? He's like, what? He's like, I'm going to buy that off you right now. And I was like, no, I don't know. I'm not going to sell it right now. And then so I just had a box for another year or two. And then finally I said, well, I'm ready to sell it. And so basically what I did was I took out the box. I took out all the back, because the back was all charcoal, and I called it Burning in the Rain. And that was sort of the story of how it wouldn't burn. Like it was burning, but it wouldn't burn completely. And the bottom half I still have. It's in it basically what it just, the bottom half just holds the ashes from the eagle. And so the reason I want to explain all this is I want to explain my board game design process. Here's another piece called Repeat the Chorus 3 Times. That's an installation piece. So I do installation pieces as well. And that's really how I see board game design is sort of like, it's almost like an installation. You're trying to get people to feel things. You're trying to get people to sort of experience things, which is what you do with an installation. And these are a couple of other pieces I did, a printmaking piece and community piece. The piece on the left was about reciprocity. And so I had these 1,500 prints made into a Chilkat design. And Chilkat blankets were given away at potlatches to high-ranking like matriarchs or chiefs. And sometimes they would cut them into pieces to make smaller pieces like frontlets or leggings or skirts to be used in dance and so on and so forth. And so I wanted to repeat that process. And what I did was I made these 1,500 prints. And when someone bought one for $50, they would tear it off the wall and I would sign it for them. And I donated all the money to student groups at OCAD. So a quarter of the money went to like the third-year students, a quarter to the Indigenous medal, and then I can't remember where the other one went. And then when I showed it again, we donated the money to this Indigenous outreach program where they would grow plants and so on and so forth. And so that was the idea. I was trying to show this like circle of reciprocity where the art is made just to benefit people. And the piece on our right is called Neon Reconciliation Explosion. And the original title for this was Reconciliation or Recolonization. And this took place over a 4-day festival where I made these 48 panels and I drew the designs on them. And I had paints and paintbrushes there. And I just asked the people, I was the only Aboriginal who worked on this because it was a festival in Toronto. And I just would give people the panel and say, just think about what reconciliation means to you and paint this panel. You don't have to use my lines if you don't want. You can paint whatever you want. And so that happened over 4 days. And this is what we end up with. Now the panel in the center and the bottom, that was my panel. And for a long time, I didn't finish it because I put it away for a year because I had lost faith in reconciliation over that time. And I didn't know what to do because I didn't want to feel like I was gaslighting the people who took part because it was a really fun and like genuine and joyous. I guess it was a performance in a sense. And so finally I realized I asked them to be honest about how they felt about reconciliation. So I have to be honest about how I feel in reconciliation. So I made sure that it looked like a facade. You can see there's sticks coming up the back. You can see the back. And then the reason I lost faith in reconciliation was because Tina Fontaine and Colton Bushy. And I thought about doing a portrait of them. I thought, well, I don't want to use them though. I don't want to use them in death. So all I did was I carved their initials in the crossbar. You see the bar there? I just carved their initials lightly so you can see it. Just to show that like that was the reason I lost faith. Anyway. And so I'm going to talk about my first game that I'm working on, Three Ravens. This is a trick-taking game, and and I'll talk about how I just started designing board games. So when the pandemic happened, basically I was all alone for like a year. And I used to play this game called French Tarot with my friends. We play it a couple times a week. And I really love this game, but it's super complicated European trick-taking game. And it's actually considered the first trick-taking game to come to Europe from Asia. And I remember talking to my friends about like, well, how come more people don't play this game? It's so great. My friends are like, oh, people are too stupid. And I was like, no, they're not. The reason nobody plays this game is because nobody knows about it. Because a lot of these old trick-taking games you have to be born into or marry into. And I thought, this amazing game, and I want to make a version of it that people can play. And so I started streamlining the rules. Like the scoring system was really insane, and there's all these like side rules. So I started streamlining it. But the thing is, when you take something away from a game, you have to rebalance it and put something back in so that you can maintain the spirit of the game. And so after a while, I realized like, this is my game. Like, this isn't just a streamlined version of this other game anymore. This is my game. Now, that being said, if you were to call it a variant of French Tarot, you wouldn't be clearly offside. But I think I changed enough. And then I wanted to bring myself to it. I wanted to bring my culture to it. And so originally it was called Tsunami. And that was only because I couldn't think of a name. And I thought I'd have this ocean theme, this idea that when you call, everybody's against you. And it wasn't the strongest name, but I put it on like a Board Game Design Lab on Facebook, and this guy started gaslighting me and, oh, you can't use tsunami. It's Asian and native. Natives can't use the word tsunami. And I was like, well, it's kind of a term in common usage. Like, and he thought of it. They looked up like the Tlingit and the Coast Salish name for tsunami. You should use that. And I was like, dude, nobody uses that term. And so I didn't change the name for the longest time because of him, even though I didn't like the name. Until finally I was like, you don't like the name? Like, who cares what that guy said? You know, so I changed it to Three Ravens, and because there's 3 cards in a deck that if you have like each card you have, it means less points you need to win. So it actually reflects my culture more, and I think it actually it's more me. because I really thought, what do I bring to the table? What do I bring to game design? And so here's some of the cards. Those are the betting cards on the left. And that's the Eclipse card is the strongest card in the deck, but it's worth 0 points. And one of the Raven cards you actually can't lose unless you play it in a hand with this card. And I'm actually playtesting the rulebook right now. And here's a couple of cards. I have these at my booth. These are art cards I made from the card art. That's the Matriarch card. So Matriarch is the most powerful pip card. And the Supernatural Raven, that's the Trickster card. It's the only one without a suit. That's the card you can't lose unless you play it with the Eclipse card. And the reason I called it the Eclipse card is each Raven has a sun in his beak. There's 3 Raven cards. That's the Moon card. That's the strongest bet. And then that's the Breakin'. That's actually an art piece I made a long time ago. I got really into Jack Kirby for a while there, so I decided to do like a Jack Kirby type sort of like pose. And I also copied the way he does like shadows. Everything else is my own. And then that's just something I made from all the digital files, put them together. And so Ulukan City is the game I'm playtesting this weekend. And this is sort of an Indigenous futures. So everything takes place in the future. And it's basically this takes place in the far future when there's like 3 mighty nations. It takes place up in Prince Rupert. And the idea is that the earth can't produce food anymore. And so there's this company called the Ulukan Food Company that produces synthetic food for the world. And the reason that they're called the Ulukan Food Company is because the Ulukan is the first harvest for us up north. So it's the first fish that comes after the winter. So it's the idea of like a new year, a new birth. We call it Nishka New Year, actually. And the thing is, like, if you look at the game, it's pretty abstract, but every decision I made was based on the theme. It was based on this idea of this Indigenous future where this sort of world had come together in these 3 places to sort of start feeding the world again. And there's a whole like 2 pages of like flavor text I'm not going to get into. But that's what so it's an area control game and action selection game. And Speedball, which is a trick-taking game I'm working on. I wanted to play test it, but it's 2 versus 2. And I'm having trouble getting one person to play my game, so 2 versus 2 isn't really feasible. And the way this originally started was I wanted to make a game about the all-native soccer tournament, which is a tournament we have up in my hometown, where every year in the summertime, people from different tribes will come together and there'll be tribal games. So each tribe will have their own soccer team, and they play each other. And then there was like, a lot of research, and people were like, oh, people don't really play sports games. So I made up a fake sport called Sukoi, which is a Coast Salish word for sockeye. But I thought it sounded like soccer. And then my whole like flavor text is that like during the Potlatch ban, the sport got banned, and then the white people started playing, and they called it Speedball, and then that's sort of where this takes place. And I'm pretty proud of this game. I want to play test it more because I think it's really great. And Feral Cat Frenzy is this sort of cat game I made. There's no real indigeneity in that one. But that's the thing, too, is Indigenous people are also allowed to make things that don't look Indigenous. You know? Yeah, it's a cute game. It's not very complex. It's fun, though. And so there's my information. And so the reason I wanted to talk about my process and my game design process is I feel like where I am in my game design process right now is I feel like I'm apprenticing. Like it was only after I apprenticed and after I started rediscovering my culture when I got to a certain point that I was able to imbue my culture into my work and really make strong and deep work. But right now I feel like game design, I'm just starting to get to that process where I'm being able to bring my culture into my games. And right now I'm just sort of doing my best. But I feel like if we do this panel in 2 years, my games will be a bit different. Because I feel like I'm just in a learning process of figuring out how to put those 2 together. And that's my presentation. Thank you very much. Oh, and that's my Homer Simpson. And as soon as I got that, after I did that, I was like, I need to start losing weight because somebody goes, "Oh, was that you?" I'm like, no. I got really sick during the pandemic, and I put on a lot of weight and got really out of shape. So, yeah, I definitely have to start taking care of myself. Thank you.
Thank you so much for my microphone feels very loud. Oh, I'm very close to the speakers. There we go. Thank you very much for those wonderful presentations. I have seen some of you present before, and I love that every time I do, I learn something different. And it's just really exciting to have you three in dialogue with a bunch of board game nerds, because usually it's just me in the room. So I get to take these guys out for dinner, and so and I'll ask my questions then. And so I'd rather hear from the audience. If you have any questions, we only have a few minutes left, but Luke and James both have tables, so you can go talk to them specifically. David's just like hanging out and roaming. You can pull him in to play some of your games. But does anybody have any questions for our speakers? I can ask a really good question that my students did last night, because I invited them to my class at UBC where we piloted this roundtable. One of the things that I found really interesting was the student question about board games, gaming culture, and and how you started talking about experiential learning, David. And so thinking about returning to games as a kind of learning as something that might even honor Indigenous learning traditions. And I really liked how James and David spoke about that. So I wanted to bring that back here about how gaming is itself a way of learning that feels authentic to some of the traditions that you're coming from. So if anybody wants to speak about that.
Yeah, so the way I was taught is that in Cree culture, at least, we learned through land-based education. So, we weren't in classrooms. We didn't have a structured set of guidelines or a structured curriculum. We learned at the feet of our elders and of our community leaders. And so we learned through experience. We learned through experiential learning by doing things. And so when we started Pametoway, and I always forget to talk about this now because it's been so long, but Pametoway is Cree for come and play. So even foundationally, even before we had a vision of doing opening a game store, play was always at the core of our core model. And so for us, it's not just honoring Indigenous traditions. And you look at things like lacrosse, and the Navajo have sticks that they use for games. And every Indigenous culture has play, whether it's Turtle Island Indigenous culture or other Indigenous cultures across the globe. Every culture incorporates play into to who they are as a distinct cultural group. But for Indigenous people, that experiential learning is so core to who we are. And in my mind, we've never moved away from that. And I think that's why you tend to see a lot of challenges for younger Indigenous folks, because they're being forced to learn in ways that aren't authentic or organic to who they are as individuals and what's culturally relevant to them. So I think it's important as a way to honor that. But for us, it even goes a step further. And I know James talked about this as well with the whole foundational design behind the truth and truth reconciliation, is that when you are engaging in play, you are activating different sorts of learning receptors in your brain, and it makes it so much easier for you to retain things, to engage in things, and to enjoy things. So implementing teachings into these games makes it so much better as a resource to engage with the content you're engaging with. So,
do either of you want to pick up on
sure.
that? Oh,
Yes.
no. Great. We have a question from the audience, or would either of you want to speak to that first question?
James is going to add. James is an actual educator, so.
All I have to say is that when I was growing up on the res, one of the elders told us that a lot of the things that we start out doing early are creating the healing and the pathways that we need to return to some of the basics. So we learn to sing before we speak. Right, we hum tunes, or we learn to dance before, early on. We learn to play, and it doesn't matter when you think about all the other animals that we share the world with. There's always play, or we would recognize it as play, and that helps to develop some of the essential skills. We try to incorporate teachings wherever possible within those games, within those skill sets, and that was one of the arguments that I've often had over this game, a game form, and talking about the truth and reconciliation. People were upset because they thought I was gamifying it, and I'm not gamifying the circumstances. What I'm doing is I'm replacing a textbook with something more interactive, more kinesthetic, so that my audience were grade 10 boys from the res. Like literacy rates very low, so I wanted them to be able to pick up a card like this, read 2 or 3 lines, and the information was there, and that's all I wanted to do. So, yeah, thank you.
I didn't really hear the question. Sorry.
Was just how potentially teaching or playing games or using games to express your own culture and history and traditions feels authentic to those traditions in any way. And if you don't have an answer to that question, that's totally.
I sort of have an answer to that, sort of an answer to that as well, because I actually saw some of the on Facebook. I saw a lot of the pushback against this game on Facebook from Indigenous people, and it really, well, I'd say maybe angry. It didn't make me angry, but I think that like the way I look at board games is I look at it as a medium. Like, how is a movie about residential school different than a game would be about a residential school? And and you can make a really bad movie about Indigenous people that's disrespectful and and over the top, but you can also make a really deep and sensitive game about it. And I think I think what the hardest part for Indigenous board gamers or designers is going to be to reach out to our own people and make them see it in a different light. Because most of my people have only played Monopoly or Sorry or poker. So showing them that this is actually a medium and it's really deep, I think that's going to be the challenge. And I think like I'm hoping to maybe make some crossover games eventually that sort of talks about maybe I don't want to say less important, but maybe things that are just more joyful, and then just bring them in and show them that this is new. And one of the reasons I really want to use my culture in my games is I just want young people to see that like you can really do anything. Like all these things are made by people, and you can be one of those people. It doesn't necessarily need board games, but if you see a native guy or native girl or woman or whomever making games, maybe they can say, well, if they can do that, I can do something else, right? And so that's sort of my hope. And yes, I think, like you said, like my people have always played games, and there's always been a lot of showmanship, especially with potlatches and so on and so forth. And that's what they did in the winters, right? They played games and danced and so on and so forth. Thanks. Is that a question?
Here, I'm going to pass you the microphone.
Okay. I was just thinking about like with the story of how like the church was one of the reasons that the Truth and Reconciliation couldn't get published for a while, and the fundamental like push-pull between board games and games in general in our society being commodity and product, and having this phenomenon of Indigenous games having to still fulfill certain commodity things, still be commodifiable, even if they are made by Indigenous creators and even published by Indigenous places, and how you kind of like play between this push-pull of like something that settler society will actually buy and afford, and so artists can actually eat, and you have the staying authentic to the vision and the and to Indigenous culture. Yeah.
The question is, how do you find the balance between making a marketable product and staying authentic? I'm gonna jump in, and then you guys can. Yeah. So that's something that we always think about at Pametwe, and it's not just with the games, but it's also with the consulting work we do. Right. For me, so I'll tell you my approach, with a big caveat that the way I do business is antithetical to how business is typically done. But I always lead with my heart first. So we take not just a decolonized, but also an anti-capitalist approach to everything we do at Pametwe. So for us, part of why we want to move into publishing is to exactly address what you're talking about. When I heard James's story yesterday and again today about the struggles that he got to bring this game to the market and the amount of barriers and challenges, and hopefully because the doors have been a little bit more open for Luke, he won't go through some of those same challenges, or at least he's got a better support network that he can tap into. But it's about creating games that are telling the stories that Indigenous people want to tell. And if the market isn't ready for that, then we create a market for it. I think that's the approach that we take, is that we are not making, when I say me, I'm not talking for James or Luke here, but I think they'd probably share this. I'm not interested in games that are looking to appease, settler colonial guilt, or that are going to, fill a niche, or, take a role of commodifying Indigenous stories for the sake of making money. What I'm interested in is raising the platform of what Indigenous storytelling looks like. And I think Luke talked a lot about that, is Indigenous art has always taken very distinct forms and very acceptable forms in settler colonial society. And the work that Luke and James are doing is moving that needle and saying Indigenous art is not just carvings and not just paintings, it's not just beadwork. It's games, it's movies, it's comics, it's everything. Anything we make is Indigenous art. And to Luke's point about the cat game, it doesn't have to be about Indigenous history or perspectives. Whatever Luke makes is Indigenous art. Whatever James makes is Indigenous art. And they are, as artists, should be free to make the art that they want to make. And I, as a publisher, as an aspiring publisher, as a game store, I will find a market for that. Because I can tell you, if you look at the history of Nunami, Thomas E. raised about $50,000, which is not an inconsequential amount of money on Kickstarter. We sold over 100 copies of Pay Medway, and we're a very small store in a very big market. So there is an appetite and there is a market for Indigenous games. You just have to have people who are passionate about making sure that people understand the value in those games. So that's the role that I see us playing. In Cree culture, we have this concept of a Scopio, a helper. I'm never going to be a game designer. I'm never going to have even a tiny fraction of the artistic skill that either of these guys have. So what I do is I use the platform I have to raise the profile of Indigenous art and to move the needle on what those look like. But for me, it's never about compromise. It's never about appeasing. It's about making the art that speaks for itself and then find a market or create a market.
Thank you for your question. When I originally created this game, it was only intended for my students. I never, like I said, I never expected it to go beyond the classroom. Like I said, Nelson Education showed interest, and if they didn't show interest, or if I didn't pay attention to the fact that they were showing interest in this game, then I probably would have just left it. I probably wouldn't have pursued it. But then as I pursued it, I also had to make a number of modifications so that it fit the colonial structures that are in place for game publishing and game producing and things like that. So we would be pioneers, I guess, in this industry, because I don't know how many Indigenous made or created games are in the business right now, but 4. Okay, so we're one of 4 games that are out there. So really, we're either setting the rules or we're breaking them, and I prefer to break them. Yeah.
I can't speak as like a publisher or anything like that, because technically I'm an amateur game designer still. But for me, at this point in my career, it's just about making a good game first. Even though the decisions I make for the game come from the story, but they have to make the game better, or they have to make the game good. And that's my goal right now. That's why if you look at that game, we're looking on City, look how that's basically looks like an abstract game. And that basically at this point, that's what it is. It's an abstract game, but there's a lot of theme and there's a lot of story in it that was behind every decision that was made. Well, not every decision. Sorry. Sometimes you have to make a decision based on gameplay, but most of the decisions are based on this theme and this sort of idea. And that's why I said I'm learning to bring my culture into it. But the first thing is always going to be that it's a good game. That's the way I can answer that question.
We have time for one more question in the very back. Thank you very much.
First and foremost, there are not enough board games about history. And I love putting something on the table that enables and empowers me to teach somebody something. So I want to thank you for making a game about history, first and foremost. My question is, what are you the most proud of in this accomplishment of publishing a game and creating a business?
I don't know. I can't just choose one particular moment. I think the way things have rolled out in my life in the last few years, with when I first started working with the game, it just seemed serendipity. It just one thing happened after another. So So I create this game. I go to an event. Somebody takes interest. I get dumped. I work hard. I find another person who's interested in producing the game, and then it just like I said, it's almost like it's almost like watching something roll out, right? It just boom, 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 and as I keep stepping forward, another part reveals itself to me and takes me off into a different direction. So I never, like I said, I never expected to be here today. I got an email last August from Biz, and here I am today. So it's just blessings and serendipity, and Creator has a plan, and I just have to listen. Yeah. Okay.
For me, it's two things. One, I'm most proud of being able to sit here at a panel with two amazing Indigenous artists and listen to them talk about their journey through game design, and know that they are absolutely pioneers and trailblazers for hopefully will be dozens more Indigenous designers who are going to come behind them. And the second thing is, it's a small thing, but about a month ago, I was out running errands, and I came into the store later in the afternoon, and we have a play area up front, and on Fridays, we have a homeschool group, and we have just a little kind of spillover table in the back between our offices and the front play area. So when I walked to the back, and I saw two young Indigenous boys, probably around 14, 15, 16, hoodies, jeans, very, not what you would particularly look at as a gamer. And I went in the back office, and I had the door open, I was just listening to them play, and they were playing this kind of low-end Kickstarter game that I backed and just threw on one of the shelves. It's called Super Camelot. Not that great of a game, but I was sitting there working, and I was just listening to them talk about them play this game that they were just absolutely in love with, and they were talking about how much they enjoyed playing it, and the fact that they probably never had a space like Pimento Way Games to go into and to feel comfortable sitting down and playing this obscure game that they would otherwise never discover. The fact that they felt comfortable enough to come into our space and just do that was so uplifting to me, because we've done a lot of work with the queer community. We've got a really great inclusive community where they show up every Thursday, and we get anywhere from 10 to 30 people. But getting Indigenous youth into the space is such a hard battle, and I know James and Luke can probably talk about that as well. Getting Indigenous youth to engage with games, and the fact that they did that, that's probably one of the things that I'm most proud of, is that our space was able to provide that small little thing, because those are the things that mean the most to me in the work that we do, is touching one or two people who otherwise wouldn't have been able to get touch with games.
I don't know. I ran a board game design class 2 nights ago at NYU. We had some Indigenous students there, and I got them all to make like simple card games from Crazy Eights, 31, and Go Fish. I just told them, we had like an hour and 50 minutes. I just said, think of a theme and change 1 or 2 rules. And they loved it. And I was pretty happy with the games they made. Were pretty excellent. The Crazy 8 games was about New York, the New York subway system, and the actions for each card were based on that different subway stop. And then the other game, the Go Fish group, made like this Oracle game where you sort of like, I can't remember the rules, but it was an Oracle game. And then the other game from 31, they made a thing called Bannock Bingo, where you sort of when you win a hand, you fill out a bingo card. And I was like, man, that Bannock Bingo is awesome. And I just emailed them. I was like, I want to work on that game with you guys. Like, let's make that game, because it sounds great. So I guess I was pretty proud of that. Proud of sharing, I guess. I should probably do more of it.
Thank you for that last question. And thank you for all of that conversation. Let's give a round of applause to our fantastic panelists. I hope you'll all go visit their tables and chat with them more, and also stick around for the next event here at the main stage, which somebody will announce probably in a minute. Maybe not. A live play of D&D. Yeah, okay. Thank you all for joining us.